The phone call came at 3:17 a.m., and Keanu Reeves knew immediately that his life was about to change forever. But it wasn't the voice on the other end that shocked him. It was what the caller knew about a night 30 years ago that no living person should remember. "Mr. Reeves," the voice said, elderly but steady. "I'm calling about October 31st, 1993, the night you saved my granddaughter's life." Keanu's blood ran cold. He hadn't spoken about that night to anyone, ever. The official records had been sealed. The witnesses had agreed to silence. Even his closest friends knew nothing about what really happened on that Halloween night in downtown Los Angeles. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said carefully, but his hands were already trembling. "River Phoenix wasn't the only one who needed saving that night," the caller continued. "You carried a 7-year-old girl out of a burning building while the cameras were focused on the Viper Room. You disappeared before the firefighters could thank you, before anyone could ask your name." The phone nearly slipped from Keanu's grasp. How could anyone possibly know about that? That night, October 31st, 1993, had been the worst and most confusing night of his life. The world knew about River's tragic death outside the Viper Room. What they didn't know was that while chaos erupted on that sidewalk, Keanu had heard something that changed everything. A child's scream coming from the apartment building across the street. While paramedics worked desperately to save his best friend, while cameras flashed and reporters gathered, Keanu had made a choice that haunted him for 3 decades. He had left River's side and run toward that scream. "Who is this?" Keanu whispered into the phone. "My name is Margaret Chen," the woman said, "and the little girl you saved that night grew up to become Dr. Sarah Chen. She's now the head of pediatric surgery at Cedars-Sinai. She saves children's lives every day because you saved hers 30 years ago." Keanu sat down hard on his kitchen chair. Sarah Chen. He knew that name. She was one of the most respected pediatric surgeons in the country. He'd seen her interviewed on medical shows, read about her groundbreaking work with children's heart surgery, but he'd never connected her to that night. "She doesn't know, does she?" he asked quietly. "She's been searching for you for 15 years, Margaret said. "Ever since she became a doctor. She calls you her guardian angel. She has no idea that the man who saved her life lost his best friend the same night." The weight of those words settled over Keanu like a suffocating blanket. For 30 years, he'd carried the guilt of leaving River's side in those final moments. He'd wondered if his presence could have made a difference, if he could have somehow changed the outcome. But now, someone was telling him that his choice had created another life entirely. "Mr. Reeves," Margaret continued, "Sarah is getting married next month, and there's something she wants to ask, something that might finally give you both the closure you've been searching for." Keanu closed his eyes. Whatever Sarah wanted to ask him, he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. But after 30 years of silence, perhaps it was time to face the truth about the night that haunted both their lives. The meeting was arranged for the following Thursday at a small cafe in Santa Monica, far from the Hollywood spotlight that had defined so much of Keanu's public life. He arrived early, choosing a corner table where he could see the entrance but remain relatively unnoticed. When Sarah Chen walked through the door, Keanu's breath caught in his throat. Even 30 years later, he could see traces of the frightened 7-year-old he'd carried down 4 flights of smoke-filled stairs. She moved with the confident grace of someone who had dedicated her life to saving others. But there was something in her eyes, a searching quality that Keanu recognized immediately. She spotted him almost instantly, as if some invisible thread had connected them across the crowded cafe. When their eyes met, Sarah's composure cracked for just a moment, and Keanu saw the little girl who had clung to his jacket while flames licked at the building around them. "Dr. Chen," he said, standing as she approached. "Sarah," she corrected softly. "Just Sarah. And you're really him." They sat in awkward silence for a moment, both struggling with the weight of a shared history that had shaped their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. "I need to ask you something," Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I need you to tell me the truth, even if it's difficult." Keanu nodded, though his chest felt tight with apprehension. "Did you know River Phoenix was dying when you left to save me?" The question hit Keanu like a physical blow. It was the one question he'd been afraid to answer for 30 years, even to himself. He was quiet for so long that Sarah began to fidget with her coffee cup, clearly regretting the directness of her question. But Keanu was lost in the memory of that night, replaying every detail with the clarity that only comes from 3 decades of obsessive recollection. "I heard the screaming first," he said finally. This high-pitched, terrified scream coming from across the street. River was unconscious by then. The paramedics were working on him, but he paused, choosing his words carefully. "I could see it in their faces. They were going through the motions, but they'd already given up hope." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent, sensing that Keanu needed to continue. "I looked up at that building, and I saw smoke pouring out of the 4th floor window. I heard that scream again, and I thought about all the times River and I had talked about making a difference in the world, about using whatever gifts we had to help people. Keanu's voice broke slightly. So I made a choice. I left my best friend's side in his final moments, and I ran toward a burning building to save a child I'd never met. Do you regret it? Sarah asked quietly. For the first time in 30 years, Keanu considered the question honestly. For the longest time, I thought I did. I carried this guilt that maybe if I'd stayed, if I'd held his hand or talked to him, maybe he would have fought harder. Maybe he would have survived. But, Sarah prompted gently, but then I started reading about your work. Dr. Sarah Chen, the pediatric surgeon who pioneered new techniques for children's heart surgery. The doctor who saved hundreds of kids who wouldn't have lived otherwise. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. You've been following my career for the past 10 years. Keanu admitted. Ever since I first saw your name in a medical journal. I didn't know for certain you were the same little girl, but something about your story felt familiar. He leaned forward, his voice growing stronger. Sarah, you've saved more lives in your career than I could save in 10 lifetimes. You've given hundreds of families their children back. Every time you walk into an operating room, you're honoring River's memory in a way I never could. Sarah was crying openly now, but she managed to speak through her tears. There's something else I need to tell you, something that might change how you see that night. Keanu waited, sensing that whatever Sarah was about to reveal would be as significant as everything that had come before. The fire that night, she said slowly. It wasn't an accident. My father had been drinking heavily since my mother died. He fell asleep with a cigarette in his hand. When I woke up to smoke filling my room, I tried to wake him, but he was unconscious. She paused, gathering strength for what came next. I could have left the apartment. The hallway was still clear when I first smelled the smoke, but I couldn't leave him there. So I stayed, trying to wake him up, trying to drag him toward the door. By the time I realized I couldn't save him, the hallway was already filled with smoke. Keanu felt the world shift around him. You were trapped because you were trying to save your father. He died that night, Sarah said quietly. The same night River died. While you were making the choice to save me instead of staying with your best friend, I was learning that sometimes love means making impossible choices. The parallel was so profound that Keanu couldn't speak for several minutes. 2 7-year-olds and a 29-year-old man, all learning the same devastating lesson on the same night. Sarah, he said finally, what did you want to ask me? Your grandmother said you had a question. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper. I'm getting married in 3 weeks. To a doctor I met during my residency. He knows about that night, about how you saved me, and he suggested something that I've been afraid to ask. She unfolded the paper, revealing what looked like a draft of a letter. I want you to walk me down the aisle, she said, her voice barely audible. I know it's presumptuous. I know we're strangers, but you gave me a life that night, and I want you to be there when I promise to share that life with someone else. Keanu stared at the letter, reading the carefully chosen words that Sarah had written and rewritten, trying to find the right way to ask a favor that seemed both impossible and perfectly natural. My father died that night, she continued, but in a way, you became something more important. You became the person who chose my life when you could have chosen anything else. For 30 years, Keanu had carried the weight of leaving River's side. He'd replayed that moment countless times, wondering if he'd made the right choice, wondering if he was a coward for running away from his best friend's death. But sitting across from Sarah Chen, Dr. Sarah Chen, who had dedicated her life to saving children because someone had once saved her, Keanu finally understood something that had eluded him for 3 decades. Sometimes the most important choice you make is the one that feels wrong in the moment, but creates ripples of goodness that extend far beyond what you can see. River would have wanted me to save you, he said quietly. He would have been angry if I'd chosen differently. Sarah smiled through her tears. Is that a yes? Keanu reached across the table and took her hand, the same hand he'd held while carrying her down those smoke-filled stairs 30 years earlier. It would be the honor of my life, he said. 3 weeks later, Keanu Reeves stood at the back of a small church in Pasadena, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time in as many minutes. He'd walked red carpets, attended premieres, and faced crowds of thousands, but nothing had prepared him for the nervous energy coursing through him as he waited to walk Sarah Chen down the aisle. The church was filled with Sarah's colleagues from the hospital, family members, and friends who had supported her throughout her journey from that frightened 7-year-old to the accomplished surgeon she'd become. But in the front row, in a place of honor, sat an empty chair with a single white rose. For River, Sarah had explained when Keanu asked about it, so he can be here too. When the music began and Sarah appeared at his side, Keanu was struck by how radiant she looked. The woman who stood beside him bore no resemblance to the smoke-stained child he'd carried to safety 3 decades earlier. Yet somehow, she was exactly who he'd always hoped she would become. Ready? She whispered, slipping her arm through his. As they began their walk down the aisle, Keanu found himself thinking about choices, about the split-second decisions that define our lives, and the consequences we can never fully predict. 30 years ago, he'd chosen to run toward danger instead of staying in comfort. He'd chosen an unknown child over his dying friend. For 3 decades, he'd questioned that choice. But now, walking beside a woman whose life's work was saving other people's children, he finally understood that some decisions transcend right and wrong. Some choices create legacies that extend far beyond our ability to comprehend them. When they reached the altar and Sarah's future husband took her hand, Keanu stepped back to take his seat. But before he could sit down, Sarah turned to the congregation. "I want to say something," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the small church. 30 years ago, a man made a choice that gave me this life. He didn't know my name. He didn't know who I would become. He simply heard a child in danger and chose to act. She looked directly at Keanu, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "River Phoenix died that night, and I know that weighs on your heart, but I need you to know that every child I save in my operating room, I save in his memory. Every family I help keep together, I do it because you showed me that love means making the hardest choices." The congregation was silent, many wiping their eyes as they began to understand the profound connection between the bride and the man who had walked her down the aisle. River's death wasn't meaningless, Sarah continued. It created a story of sacrifice and love that has saved hundreds of lives. And that story begins with a man who chose compassion over comfort, hope over despair. She turned back to Keanu one final time. "Thank you for teaching me that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go." As the ceremony continued, Keanu sat in that small church and finally, after 30 years, forgave himself for the choice that had haunted. Sometimes, he realized, our greatest regrets become other people's greatest blessing. And sometimes, love looks like running toward a burning building while the world falls apart behind you.